The old wooden floor of the adoption hall creaked beneath. He polished shoes and nervous, shuffling feet. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, coated in a thin veil of dust, casting long golden streaks across the room. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper, a scent that always made 7-year-old Eliza think of waiting. Rows of folding chairs had been arranged neatly, and a long table near the front held stacks of forms and pens, aligned with careful precision. Volunteers moved about with tight smiles and encouraging nods, whispering reminders to the children lined up along the wall. Eliza stood at the very end of that line. Her light blue dress, ironed that morning by Mrs. Hale, hung just a little loose at the shoulders. The fabric had softened with age, and the hem bore faint stitching where it had been let out for another child before her. She kept smoothing it down with trembling hands, pressing imaginary wrinkles flat. Her brown curls were tied back with a white ribbon that refused to sit straight, and every few seconds she reached up to adjust it, as if perfection might make her more noticeable. "Remember to smile," Mrs. Hale had whispered earlier, kneeling to Eliza's height. "Just be yourself." Eliza wasn't sure who that was anymore, the smiling girl or the quiet one who lay awake at night counting ceiling cracks. Families began to enter the hall, their voices low but hopeful. Couples, single parents, a few older pairs with silver hair and kind eyes. They walked slowly past the line of children, studying faces the way shoppers study precious items behind glass. Some knelt to ask questions. Others exchanged thoughtful glances with the director before moving on. The first child chosen was a small boy with sandy hair and dimples that deepened when he grinned. A young couple approached him almost immediately. They laughed at something he said. Papers were signed. Tears streamed freely. The boy waved goodbye, his tiny hand wrapped tightly in his new mother's fingers. A flicker of hope sparked inside Eliza's chest. She straightened her posture, lifted her chin, smiled wider. Another family stopped in front of a girl with bright red braids. The woman brushed a tear from her cheek as she hugged the child close. Applause rippled softly through the room as they gathered their belongings. The line grew shorter. Eliza shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Her shoes felt too tight. Her heartbeat echoed loudly in her ears, drowning out the murmurs around her. Each time footsteps approached, she inhaled deeply, preparing to speak clearly and politely. She had practiced her introduction all week. "My name is Eliza. I like drawing and helping in the kitchen." The words hovered behind her lips, ready. A tall man in a grey suit paused briefly in front of her. His eyes met hers for half a second. She offered her best smile. He nodded politely, then moved on. The spark inside her chest dimmed slightly. 2 more children were chosen. Then another. The sounds of celebration began to feel distant, as if they belonged to another room entirely. Eliza's hands grew colder despite the warmth of the sunlit hall. She pressed them together to stop the trembling. "She seems very quiet," she overheard one woman whisper to her husband as they passed. "Maybe a younger one," the man replied gently. The words weren't cruel, but they settled heavily on her small shoulders. She tried to look less quiet, tried to widen her eyes to appear brighter, more alive. She even stepped forward a fraction when the next family approached, but they were already focused on the boy beside her. Within minutes, he too was walking toward the exit, clutching a stuffed bear and smiling through tears. The line dissolved until only 3 children remained, then 2. Then only Eliza. The empty space beside her felt enormous. The wall behind her seemed to press closer, as though reminding her there was nowhere else to stand. The chatter softened. Chairs scraped against the floor as families gathered coats and bags. Papers were stacked. Pens were capped. Mrs. Hale approached slowly, her expression carefully composed. "It's all right, sweetheart," she murmured. "Sometimes it just takes a little longer." Eliza nodded because that was what brave girls did. But her throat burned. She stared at the wooden floorboards, tracing the cracks with her eyes. She counted them to keep from crying. 1, 2, 3, 4. The front doors creaked open as the last family exited. Cold air slipped inside, brushing against her ankles. The room felt bigger than ever, emptier than ever. Her chest tightened. The smile she had practiced so carefully began to tremble at the edges. She pressed her lips together, fighting the tears. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry in front of everyone. She wouldn't be the girl who made things awkward. But now there was no one left to impress. Her voice came out smaller than she intended, barely louder than the creak of settling wood. "Nobody picked me." The words floated into the quiet room and seemed to echo back at her. It wasn't anger in her tone. It wasn't accusation. It was confusion, as if she genuinely could not understand how she had stood there, heart open and hopeful, and still become invisible. Her shoulders began to shake despite her efforts to steady them. A single tear slipped down her cheek, landing softly on the front of her blue dress. She wiped it away quickly, glancing toward Mrs. Hale with embarrassment. "I tried to smile," she whispered. "Oh, Eliza," Mrs. Hale breathed, stepping closer. But before she could say more, a heavy sound interrupted the silence. A bootstep, slow, measured, certain. Both of them turned toward the entrance. The doors, which had nearly shut completely, were pushed open once more. A tall figure stood framed by the fading sunlight. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow across his face, and his denim shirt was neatly buttoned despite the dust. Clinging to his boots, a silver belt buckle caught the light as he stepped inside. He removed his hat respectfully, holding it against his chest. "I reckon I'm not too late," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying easily across the room. Mrs. Hale blinked in surprise. "We thought everyone had arrived." He didn't answer immediately. His gaze had already found Eliza. She froze under his attention, unsure whether to look away or hold his eyes. There was no rush in his expression, no hurried evaluation. He simply looked at her, not past her, not around her, at her, as though she were the only child who had ever stood in that spot. He began walking forward, each step deliberate against the wooden floor. The echo of his boots filled the space that had moments earlier felt so hollow. Eliza's heart pounded again, but differently this time. He stopped a few feet in front of her and slowly lowered himself to one knee so they were eye level. Up close, she could see faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the kind carved by sun and years of squinting across wide horizons. For a moment he didn't speak. He simply waited. And in that waiting there was no impatience, only presence. "What's your name?" he asked finally, his voice gentler now. "Eliza," she managed, her fingers twisting the fabric of her dress. He nodded once, as if committing it to memory. "Eliza," he repeated thoughtfully. Her lip trembled again, the weight of the day still pressing heavily against her small frame. "Nobody picked me," she said, the confession breaking free once more. The man glanced briefly at Mrs. Hale, then back at Eliza. Something firm settled in his expression, not pity, not hesitation. Certainty. He lifted one hand slightly, simple and unshaken. "Mine," he said. The truck rumbled steadily down the long stretch of open road, its tires humming against the pavement as golden fields rolled past on either side. Eliza sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her small hands folded tightly in her lap, as if she were afraid that touching anything might make it disappear. The seat smelled faintly of leather and sun-warmed dust. Outside the window, the world felt enormous, wider than anything she had ever known. No tall buildings, no crowded sidewalks, just sky, endless open sky. Daniel drove with one hand resting loosely on the steering wheel, the other propped against the window frame. He didn't seem rushed. He didn't seem nervous. He just drove steady and calm, as though this road was one he had traveled 1,000 times before. Maybe he had, but today it felt different. Today there was someone beside him. Eliza risked a small glance in his direction. His face was quiet, thoughtful, not smiling widely, not frowning, just peaceful. That made her chest feel a little less tight. After several minutes of silence, he spoke without looking at her. "You ever been out to the country before?" She shook her head, then realized he might not see it. "No, sir." He gave a slight nod. "It's quieter out here. Some folks don't like that. But I find you can hear yourself think." She wasn't sure what that meant, so she just nodded again. They passed a wooden sign hanging slightly crooked on a fence post. Daniel slowed the truck and turned down a dirt road. Dust rose behind them in soft clouds. Eliza gripped the edge of her seat as the tires bumped gently over uneven ground. At the end of the road stood a modest ranch, house with a wide porch and a slanted tin roof that shimmered. Under the late afternoon sun, a red barn sat a short distance away, its paint faded but sturdy. Fences stretched across the land, enclosing wide pastures where the grass swayed lazily in the breeze. Daniel parked the truck and turned off the engine. The sudden quiet felt almost loud. "Well," he said softly, glancing at her, "this is home." Home. The word felt fragile in her mind, like something made of glass. He stepped out first, walking around to her side and opening the door. He didn't rush her. He simply stood there and offered his hand. She stared at it for a second. It was large, calloused, steady. A working hand. Slowly, she placed her small hand into his. The ground felt solid beneath her shoes as she climbed down. The air smelled different here, cleaner somehow, touched with hay and warm earth. A breeze brushed against her cheeks, tugging at her curls. A soft neigh echoed from the direction of the barn. Eliza startled slightly. Daniel chuckled under his breath. "That'll be Maple. She's the curious one." They walked toward the fence where a chestnut horse stood watching them. Maple's ears flicked forward and she stepped closer, her large dark eyes studying Eliza with calm interest. "You can say hello," Daniel encouraged gently. "She won't bite, not unless you're hiding apples in your pockets." Eliza hesitated, then extended her hand slowly, just as she had seen in picture books. Maple lowered her head and sniffed her fingers, warm breath tickling her skin. A small giggle escaped Eliza before she could stop it. The sound seemed to settle into the air like sunlight. Daniel's expression softened at the edges. "Reckon she likes you." Eliza smiled shyly, her earlier sadness momentarily forgotten. "She's soft. Brush her every morning and she'll stay that way," he replied. "Maybe you can help me with that." The idea of being needed, even for something small, made her chest feel warm. They walked toward the house. The porch steps creaked under their weight as Daniel pushed open the front door. Inside, the space was simple but welcoming. A worn leather couch faced a stone fireplace. A wooden table stood in the center of the room, with 4 sturdy chairs around it. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains, casting gentle patterns across the floor. Eliza stepped inside cautiously, as though entering a museum where everything was precious. On one wall hung a framed photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a bright smile. Fresh wildflowers sat in a vase. Beneath it, she paused, staring. Daniel followed her gaze and removed his hat again, almost instinctively. "That's my wife, Clara," he said quietly. "She passed a few years back." Eliza looked up at him. "Does she live here?" "In a way," he answered, his voice steady but soft. "She loved this place. Loved kids even more." Eliza studied the photograph again. The woman's smile didn't feel sad. It felt warm. Daniel cleared his throat gently. "Come on, I want to show you something." He led her down a short hallway to a small bedroom. The walls were painted pale yellow, bright enough to feel cheerful but soft enough to feel safe. A twin bed sat against one wall, neatly made with a quilt patterned with tiny horses. A small wooden dresser stood nearby, and on top of it rested a simple lamp and an empty picture frame. Eliza stepped inside slowly. "For me?" she asked in a voice barely above a whisper. "For you," Daniel confirmed. "Figured we could add your own touches. Maybe some drawings on the walls if you're the artistic type." Her fingers brushed over the quilt carefully, as if it might vanish if she pressed too hard. No one had ever prepared a room just for her before. She had shared spaces, borrowed corners, slept in beds that belonged to everyone and no one at the same time. "This is mine?" she asked again, needing to be sure. Daniel leaned against the doorframe. "Every bit of it." She turned to face him fully now, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "Why did you pick me?" The question hung heavy between them. He didn't answer immediately. He stepped into the room and crouched slightly so they were closer in height. "I didn't see a girl nobody wanted," he said carefully. "I saw a girl who stood there trying her hardest not to cry. I saw someone brave enough to keep smiling even when it hurt." Her throat tightened. "You don't even know me," she whispered. He gave a small nod. "That's true. But I'd like to." Silence settled around them, but it didn't feel empty. It felt patient. I'm not very loud, she admitted. Or funny. That's all right, he replied. This house has enough quiet to go around. A tiny smile tugged at her lips. And, he added, I reckon laughter grows better when you don't force it. She looked down at her shoes, thinking. The fear that had clung to her all day was still there, but it felt smaller now, manageable. Tentatively, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his waist. He froze for half a second, surprised more by the trust than the gesture, then gently rested his arms around her shoulders. Outside, the wind moved through the tall grass. Somewhere in the distance, Maple let out another soft neigh. Daniel spoke quietly into the stillness. You're safe here, Eliza. She closed her eyes, letting the words settle deep inside her, in the place that had echoed with doubt for so long. That night, as she lay beneath the horse-patterned quilt, staring at the ceiling of a room that was finally hers, she listened to the unfamiliar sounds of crickets and wind instead of traffic and distant voices. The house creaked softly, not in a lonely way, but in a living way. A gentle knock came at her door. Everything all right? Daniel's voice asked. Yes, she called softly. He stepped inside just enough to see her tucked in. Breakfast is early around here, but we can start slow tomorrow. She hesitated before speaking again. You really meant it? When you said mine, he met her eyes steady and certain. I've never said a word I didn't mean, he answered. She nodded, holding on to that promise as sleep began to pull her under. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like the last one left behind. She felt chosen.